Hat size not supposed to grow. Your shoe size isn't supposed to grow 2 or 3 sizes. And you're not supposed to go at age 38 from a lifetime batting average of 290 and all of a sudden hit 370 and 362.
Yeah, no.
You're not supposed to have a lifetime slugging percentage of 556, which is good, but nowhere near the top of the list. Lifetime slugging average of 556, then slug 863 and have 2 other seasons over 800 and one at 799 in your late 30s and early 40s. It's incredible to maintain a high level of performance when most players are declining, let alone to improve stratospherically over anything you've ever done with an established pattern of performance for 13, 14 years, or anyone in the whole history of the game has ever.
For decades, Bob Costas was the voice that made you feel like baseball mattered more than any other game on earth. He brought elegance to the broadcast booth, poetry to the play-by-play, and a respect for the tradition of the sport that felt almost sacred, like he was protecting something precious that belonged to all of us. But that reverence turned to rage. Costas became a moral referee, calling out heroes and labeling achievements as hollow or tainted. Pete Rose, the all-time hits leader, passed in September 2024, reigniting debates about legacy and whether Costas protects the game or just plays judge. If you want this story to reach more baseball fans and spark the debate it deserves, hit the hype feature and give this video some hype, so we can keep bringing you deep dives into the legends who shaped and scarred the sport in ways we are still trying to understand. 7 legends Costas clashed with from bottom to top. Number 7. Curt Schilling. This one is different from all the rest on this list because Schilling never got caught up in the steroid mess that poisoned so many careers. No PED links. His numbers are clean in that sense, and they are spectacular. 3,116 strikeouts. 216 wins, a postseason record of 11 wins and 2 losses, with an earned run average of 2.23, peak postseason dominance. Hall of Fame numbers. Costas said in 2019, it was when, not if. But then something shifted in the culture and in the conversation. Schilling's post-career life got loud and messy and impossible to ignore. His social media presence became a minefield of controversial takes that alienated huge portions of the baseball community. And the writers who vote for the Hall of Fame started to rethink what the character clause really means when everyone has a platform and every bad opinion lives forever on the internet. Costas found himself in an uncomfortable position, which is rare for a man who usually knows exactly where he stands on every issue. He does not attack Schilling's pitching because there is nothing to attack, but he has acknowledged the complications in public statements. The character clause in the Hall of Fame guidelines is supposed to measure integrity and sportsmanship, but does that apply to what a player does after retirement, when the uniform is hanging in a closet and the cleats are gathering dust? Schilling's support on the Hall of Fame ballot started strong, hitting 71.1%, which is close to the 75% threshold needed for induction. But then it dropped to 58% after he asked to be removed from the ballot entirely, frustrated by the way the process had turned into a referendum on his politics instead of his pitching. Costas observed that some people view the Hall as a marketing tool for baseball's image. A plaque in Cooperstown is not just about stats and wins and strikeouts. It is about representing the sport's best values, being an ambassador for the game even after you stop playing it. And Schilling's post-career behavior made that impossible for a lot of voters. Schilling became a test case for a fundamental question. If you let him in based purely on pitching, you are saying performance trumps everything else, that what happens on the field is all that matters, and the rest is noise. If you keep him out based on his public heel turn and the damage he did to baseball's reputation, you are saying character counts even after the uniform comes off. That being in the Hall of Fame is a privilege you can lose by being a bad person in retirement. Costas seems torn between these two positions, but the fact that Schilling is even on this list, even as the lowest ranked name, shows how much the Hall of Fame debate has evolved beyond just looking at numbers on a page and deciding if they are good enough. Number 6. Pete Rose. This is where Bob Costas's philosophy gets tangled up in mercy and punishment, and the question of whether redemption is ever possible for people who break the most sacred rules and then spend decades lying about it. Rose is the all-time leader in hits with 4,256, a number so massive and unreachable that it feels like it will stand forever, a monument to consistency and longevity and sheer relentless effort over 24 seasons. But Rose also broke the cardinal rule, the one that is posted in every single major league clubhouse in bold letters that nobody can miss. Do not bet on baseball. Rose did it anyway, and then he lied about it for decades. Looked reporters and commissioners and fans straight in the eye and swore he never did it, that the accusations were false and the evidence was manufactured. Costas has been firm and unwavering on the ban from employment. He supports keeping Rose out of any job in professional baseball, whether that is managing or coaching or working in the front office, because the integrity of the game depends on that bright line that cannot be crossed. If you gamble on the sport you manage or play, you are done forever. No exceptions, no second chances. The rule exists for a reason, and Rose knew the rule and broke it anyway. But here is where Costas gets interesting and almost compassionate in a way that surprises people who think he is just a heartless moralist. He distinguishes between Rose's eligibility for employment in baseball and his presence in the Hall of Fame, arguing that those are two separate questions that deserve two separate answers. Costas has proposed what he calls a simple solution that feels almost elegant in its clarity. Induct Rose into the Hall of Fame as a player based on his 4,256 hits that nobody can take away from him, but include a statement at the bottom of his plaque that reads, "Banned from baseball in 1989 for life," as part of the official historical record. Costas argues that justice can be tempered by mercy and common sense, that the punishment for gambling should be permanent exclusion from employment, but not permanent erasure from history. The hits were earned before most of the gambling took place, or at least before we have definitive proof that it was happening during his playing career. And the Hall of Fame is supposed to be a museum of baseball history, not a moral purity test where only saints get in. But Commissioner Rob Manfred has refused to lift the ban, and his reasoning cuts deep. Manfred says Rose lacks contrition and a mature understanding of his conduct. Rose still does not get it, still does not understand the damage he did or why it matters. Costas seems frustrated by that assessment, not because he wants Rose back in the game as a manager or coach, but because he has interviewed Rose multiple times over the years and watched him dodge the truth over and over again, watched him lie even when the lies were obvious and pointless. Rose spent years, literally decades, denying he bet on baseball, calling the accusers liars and conspiracy theorists, only to admit it later in a book deal when it suited him financially, and the statute of limitations on shame had apparently expired. And even now, after all the admissions and all the evidence, questions still linger like ghosts that will not go away. Johnny Bench, Rose's teammate and one of the greatest catchers in history, has wondered out loud whether Rose was betting during his playing days, not just his managing days, and if he was, then the entire foundation of his career collapses, because every at-bat becomes suspicious. Every hit could have been influenced by gambling debts or bets he needed to cover. That uncertainty haunts his legacy like a curse. When Rose passed away in 2024, the debate flared up all over again, hotter and angrier than ever. Should the Hall of Fame induct a man who broke the most sacred rule in baseball? Should they forgive him because he is dead and can no longer benefit from the honor? Or should they hold the line forever as a warning to future generations? Costas's answer is yes, induct him, but with full transparency. Let the plaque tell the whole story, the good and the bad, the 4,000 hits and the lifetime ban. Let fans know what he did and what it cost him, and let them make their own judgments about whether he deserves to be remembered as a hero or a cautionary tale. But even that middle ground feels uncomfortable for a lot of people, and Costas's own ambivalence, the way he struggles to balance punishment and mercy, shows just how hard it is to separate the player from the person when the person spent decades lying and never showed real remorse. Number 5. Sammy Sosa. The summer of 1998 should have been pure magic, the kind of baseball season that saves the sport and reminds everyone why they fell in love with it in the first place. Baseball was still bleeding from the disaster of the 1994 strike, when owners and players destroyed an entire World Series over money and left fans feeling betrayed and abandoned. People were angry, disillusioned, ready to walk away and find something else to care about. And then Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire started hitting home runs at a pace that felt impossible, that made you check the box scores twice because the numbers could not be real. Sosa was the lovable one in that chase, the guy who blew kisses to his mother in the stands and ran out to right field with a hop in his step, like a kid playing Little League. He surpassed 60 home runs in 3 separate seasons, a feat that seemed to prove he was not just a flash in the pan, not just riding a hot streak, but genuinely operating at a level that defied historical precedent. Costas was there for all of it, calling games, feeling the electricity in the stadiums, watching grown men cry when Sosa and McGwire hit milestones. But later, years later, when the truth came out about the performance-enhancing drug era, Costas described that summer as hollowed out, like a beautiful memory that got poisoned retroactively by reality. It is like finding out your favorite childhood movie was made by terrible people, and now you cannot watch it the same way ever again. When the performance-enhancing drug era became undeniable, when the evidence piled up and the denial stopped working, Costas looked back at those absurd numbers and felt betrayed on a personal level. Not just professionally as a broadcaster, but emotionally as a fan who wanted to believe. The fans who invested in that summer, who gathered around televisions and radios and believed they were watching something pure and historic, had been sold a lie. and the emotional damage from that betrayal cannot be calculated. Costas has said the game became unwatchable for people who value context and history because the numbers were so inflated they broke the internal logic of the sport, made it impossible to compare eras or understand what greatness even meant anymore. If Sosa can hit 66 home runs in a season, what does that say about Babe Ruth's 60 or Roger Maris's 61? Are those achievements diminished, or do they become more impressive because they were done without chemical help? Sosa and McGwire became symbols of a chaos that nearly ruined baseball's credibility. And while McGwire eventually admitted to using steroids and tried to apologize, Sosa has stayed mostly silent, which makes it even harder to process the betrayal. Silence feels like guilt, like an admission that cannot be spoken out loud. Costas treats Sosa as part of a collective betrayal, a player who took the magic of 1998, the summer that was supposed to save baseball, and turned it into a cautionary tale about what happens when the pursuit of records becomes more important than the integrity of the game. That summer was supposed to be redemption. Instead, it became Exhibit A in the case against the steroid era, proof that the whole thing was rotten from the start. Number 4. Mark McGwire. If Sammy Sosa was the lovable one in the 1998 chase, Mark McGwire was the giant, and I mean that literally. 6 feet 5 inches tall, 250 pounds of muscle that looked sculpted by something other than genetics. A man who looked like he was built in a laboratory specifically to hit baseballs over fences and into the stratosphere. In 1998, McGwire hit 70 home runs, shattering Roger Maris's single-season record of 61 that had stood for 37 years and felt untouchable. Costas was there for every swing, every milestone, every celebration, and at the time it felt like a gift from the baseball gods. The sport needed a hero, needed something to make people forget the strike and the greed and the ugliness, and McGwire delivered in ways that felt almost too good to be true. And it turns out it was too good to be true. The magic did not last because it was never real. McGwire's later admission that he used steroids during that entire season retroactively ruined everything, turned the most exciting summer in baseball history into a fraud that makes people feel stupid for believing in it. Costas has spoken with real sadness, not anger but genuine grief, about how that summer got hollowed out, how the emotional investment that fans made, the hope and joy and belief that baseball was back, turned out to be based on a pharmaceutical enhancement, not natural talent. For Costas, the issue is not just that McGwire cheated and broke the rules. It is that the numbers he put up were so absurd they made the game unwatchable for anyone who cares about historical continuity and context. When you compare McGwire's 70 home runs to the numbers from previous eras, when you look at what Babe Ruth did or Hank Aaron or Willie Mays, it does not fit. It breaks the logic of the sport. It is like someone claiming they can run a marathon in 30 minutes. The number is so far outside the realm of possibility that it stops being impressive and starts being suspicious. Costas describes the steroid era as a chaos that nearly destroyed baseball's credibility, and McGwire is one of the central figures in that collapse, one of the main characters in a tragedy that hurt millions of people who just wanted to watch a clean game. What makes it worse is that McGwire eventually came clean, admitted what he did, but only after years of evasion and a famously awkward congressional hearing where he refused to talk about the past and dodged questions like a guilty man with something to hide. Costas respects honesty, even late honesty, even admissions that come years too late to matter. But he cannot forgive what that summer cost the sport. 1998 was supposed to be baseball's redemption story, the season that brought fans back and proved the game still mattered. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that went wrong, when players and owners and the media all looked the other way because home runs were good for business and ticket sales and television ratings. Number 3. Alex Rodriguez. If Barry Bonds was raw power and confrontation, a man who attacked critics head-on and never apologized for anything, then Alex Rodriguez was the complete opposite in terms of presentation. Polished to a shine, calculated down to the smallest detail, the epitome of the professional athlete as a cross between a stage-managed boy band and a corporate pitchman selling products to demographics. Costas has described Rodriguez's career as meticulously managed, a trajectory that felt less like a natural rise through talent and hard work, and more like a branding exercise designed by marketing executives in boardrooms. And the problem is not just the image, the fake smile, and the corporate endorsements in the sense that nothing about him was real. It is the performance-enhancing drugs that kept showing up in his story like a recurring nightmare. Rodriguez had multiple connections to PEDs, spanning his time with the Texas Rangers all the way through the Biogenesis scandal in Miami, and each revelation made it harder to believe anything he said or did. He admitted in federal court, under oath where lying has consequences, to using performance enhancers during his 2007 MVP season, the year he won the award for being the best player in the league while cheating. And he reportedly paid $900,000 to a relative to keep quiet about his medical connections, which is hush money, which is consciousness of guilt, which is proof that he knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway. For Costas, Rodriguez represents something more insidious than just a player who cheated. He represents a period of transition that fundamentally damaged the historical continuity of baseball stats. The idea that you can compare players across eras and have those comparisons mean something. The game became more bureaucratic, more standardized, more efficiency-driven, and the artistry of the past, the beauty and creativity and individual style, got replaced by raw output and launch angles and exit velocity. Rodriguez's numbers are impressive on paper, no question, but they feel synthetic, like they were manufactured in a laboratory rather than earned through sweat and talent and years of dedication. Costas does not just criticize Rodriguez for cheating, although that is part of it. He criticizes him for turning baseball into a corporate product, where the player is less important than the brand, and the brand is built on lies that everyone pretends to believe. Rodriguez's public persona was so calculated that it created a detachment from the fan base, a sense that nobody really knew who he was or what he cared about beyond money and fame. And when the PED connections kept surfacing, over and over again, like bodies floating to the surface of a lake, it confirmed what a lot of people already suspected deep down. This was not a natural athlete reaching his peak through hard work. This was a constructed icon whose greatness was synthesized rather than organic. And for Costas, that is an unforgivable betrayal of what baseball is supposed to be at its core. Number 2, Roger Clemens. Clemens is the biological paradox that drives Bob Costas absolutely crazy because the numbers make no sense if you believe in the natural aging process and the way human bodies work. Pitchers are supposed to decline in their late 30s. It is not optional. It is biology. Their arms wear out from throwing thousands of pitches at maximum velocity. Their velocity drops from 95 miles per hour to 90, then to 85, then they retire. Their bodies break down from the accumulated stress of a career spent putting unnatural strain on joints and ligaments. That is the natural curve of a baseball career, the arc that every pitcher follows whether they like it or not. But Roger Clemens did the opposite, and that is what makes Costas lose his mind. Clemens got better as he got older. He dominated in his late 30s and early 40s at a level that defied everything we know about aging and athletics and the limits of the human body. Costas has called this statistically impossible without exogenous help, outside pharmaceutical intervention, steroids or human growth hormone or some cocktail of chemicals that let him cheat time itself. Clemens achieved a level of late career performance that has no natural precedent in the entire history of Major League Baseball. And for Costas, that statistical anomaly is proof enough even without a failed drug test. It does not matter that Clemens never got caught in the traditional sense. The numbers themselves are the evidence, the smoking gun that proves something unnatural was happening. When a 40-year-old pitcher throws harder than he did at 30, when his body gets stronger instead of weaker, when he defies every biological rule we understand, that is not training or nutrition or good genetics. That is chemistry. Costas has consistently argued that Clemens was a great athlete in his younger years, genuinely elite, a Hall of Famer based on his early career alone. But his late career achievements, the Cy Young Awards he won in his 40s, cannot be viewed in the same light as the achievements of previous generations who played clean and aged naturally and watched their skills decline like everyone else. And that belief, that conviction that Clemens cheated even without a positive test, informs Costas's broader stance on the Hall of Fame and what it should represent. He has advocated loudly and publicly for keeping suspected steroid users out of the Hall entirely, making it clear that suspicion is enough, that you do not need proof beyond a reasonable doubt to protect the institution. Or at the very least, if you must induct these players because their numbers demand it, then ensure that their plaques explicitly acknowledge the era they played in, and the controversies surrounding their statistics. This transparency model is designed to prevent the historical record from being permanently distorted, to make sure that future generations understand the context and can make their own judgments. For Costas, Roger Clemens represents the ultimate test of what the Hall of Fame stands for. Do you reward the numbers even if you suspect they were artificially enhanced and fraudulent? Or do you protect the integrity of the institution even if it means keeping out one of the most dominant pitchers who ever lived? Number 1, Barry Bonds. This is the feud that defines everything Bob Costas believes about baseball and integrity and what happens when greatness gets corrupted by greed and chemicals. Bonds versus Costas is not just a disagreement about statistics or Hall of Fame votes. It is a philosophical war about what what baseball means, who gets to decide what counts as legitimate, and whether the truth matters more than the spectacle. Costas has been absolutely relentless in pointing out that Bonds' career underwent a fundamental transmutation, a shift so dramatic and so suspicious that it defies the natural aging curve of an athlete and demands explanation. Before 1999, Bonds was already a Hall of Famer, and Costas has said this repeatedly to make it clear he is not denying Bonds' early talent. His lifetime batting average through the end of 1998 was .290, and he hit a home run every 16 at-bats. That is elite. That is historically grounded. That is undeniably great without any qualifications or asterisks. But then something changed in Bonds' body and his performance. And the change was so extreme it looked like a different player wearing the same uniform. Bonds entered what Costas calls the stratosphere, where his numbers became statistically untethered from previous historical precedents and floated into a realm that made no sense. His head got bigger. His body got more muscular. His power exploded in ways that violated every rule of aging and biology. And when he broke Hank Aaron's career home run record, an achievement that should have been celebrated as one of the greatest moments in sports history, Costas described it as ambivalent and tainted, words that cut deep because they strip away the joy and replace it with suspicion. The underlying allegations of cheating overshadowed the achievement completely, turned it from a celebration into a crime scene. The personal animosity between Bonds and Costas hit its peak when Bonds, frustrated by the constant scrutiny and the questions that would not go away, called Costas a little midget man and questioned his fundamental knowledge of the game, as if being short somehow disqualified Costas from understanding baseball or reporting facts. Costas's response was a masterclass in using humor to reassert authority and destroy an opponent with a smile. He said, "As anyone can plainly see, I am 5 foot 6.5 inches tall and a strapping 150 pounds. And unlike some people, I came by all of it naturally." That line was not just a joke for the audience. It was a direct shot at Bonds' alleged physical inflation, a way of saying that Costas' body might be small, but it is real, while Bonds' body might be impressive, but it is fake. Costas went even further, arguing that his physical stature was completely irrelevant to the validity of the information he was reporting, dismissing Bonds' insult as an ad hominem attack, the kind of desperate move typical of people who have no credible argument and resort to personal attacks because they cannot win on facts. For Costas, the issue with Barry Bonds is simple and clear. Bonds was great in his 20s and early 30s, genuinely one of the best players in baseball. Then he became superhuman in his late 30s, and that transition was not natural. It was pharmaceutical. It was cheating. And when the home run record fell in 2007, when Bonds hit number 756 and passed Hank Aaron, it did not feel like a celebration of excellence. It felt like a funeral for the integrity of the numbers, for the idea that baseball statistics mean something and tell a coherent story across generations. Costas believes baseball is unique among American sports because the statistical records function as a historical record, a way to compare Babe Ruth to Willie Mays to Barry Bonds and have those comparisons mean something real. Any artificial inflation of those figures, any cheating or pharmaceutical enhancement, is a strike against the game's institutional soul, a betrayal of everyone who played clean and everyone who cares about the truth. Bonds represents the ultimate symbol of that betrayal in Costas's mind. His 73 home runs in 2001 are a statistical anomaly, a number so far outside the historical norm that it breaks the internal logic of the sport completely. And for Costas, that makes Bonds the player he dislikes most on this entire list, not out of personal hatred or petty grudges, but out of a professional lament for what the game lost when it allowed players like Bonds to rewrite the record books through chemistry instead of talent. But Costas's critiques do not stop with these 7 names, because the rot goes deeper than individual players. He has also taken aim at Jose Canseco, the whistleblower who was ultimately right about the facts of the steroid era, but wrong for the game in his presentation and his motives. Canseco wrote a book called Juiced in 2005, naming names and exposing the widespread use of performance enhancers across Major League Baseball. The Mitchell Report, the official investigation into steroids, later vindicated much of what Canseco said, proving that he was telling the truth even when people called him a liar and a traitor. But Costas views Canseco as a symbol of chaos, a man who profited from destroying the internal trust of the sport, who turned the steroid scandal into a money-making opportunity instead of trying to fix the problem quietly. Canseco may have told the truth, and telling the truth matters, but he did it in a way that felt exploitative and self-serving. And for a traditionalist like Costas, who values decorum and respect for the institution, that makes Canseco hard to stomach. Canseco is the messenger the baseball establishment treated with a mixture of acknowledgement and disdain, a necessary evil who helped expose the problem, but also made it worse by turning it into a circus and a spectacle. And then there is the modern game itself, the way baseball is played today, and Costas hates it. He has gone after the 3 true outcomes approach with real venom, the strategy where a plate appearance most often ends in one of 3 results: a home run, a walk, or a strikeout. Nothing else matters under this philosophy. Contact does not matter. Moving runners over does not matter. Putting the ball in play and forcing the defense to make plays does not matter. Costas sees this as a decline in the artistry of baseball, a loss of the skills that once defined legends like Rod Carew and Tony Gwynn, players who could control the strike zone and put pressure on pitchers and make things happen without hitting the ball 400 feet. Costas argues that the focus on power and launch angle has led to a generation of players who cannot do the small things, who strike out at rates that would have been embarrassing in previous eras, but are now considered acceptable. He often points to Tony Gwynn as the antithesis of the modern slugger, the perfect example of what baseball used to value. Gwynn averaged fewer than 22 strikeouts per season over a 20-year career, striking out once every 23.57 plate appearances. That level of contact and control is almost unimaginable today. In contrast, modern leaders in contact, like Luis Arias, strike out far more frequently, once every 14 plate appearances, and that is considered elite in the current era. For Costas, this shift represents a fundamental change in what constitutes an elite hitter, a change that severs the statistical links between generations. The game played in the 2020s is so different in style and mechanics from the game played in the 1920s that you cannot compare them anymore. So where does this leave baseball and the Hall of Fame and all the arguments that will not die? Costas has spent decades building a case against the modern era, arguing that the sport lost its way when it prioritized individual achievement and entertainment over institutional integrity and honesty. His critiques of Bonds and Clemens and Rodriguez and Rose and all the rest are not expressions of personal animosity or petty feuds. They are professional laments for the loss of what he considers the game's essential truths, the things that made baseball special and different from every other sport. And now, as the Hall of Fame continues to exclude these legends year after year, the tensions Costas has documented are reaching a breaking point that feels unsustainable. The character clause, written into the Hall of Fame guidelines by the board of directors, remains the primary hurdle for all these players. It says that voters should consider integrity and sportsmanship, not just statistics. Bonds and Clemens spent 10 years on the ballot, seeing slight gains in their voting percentages, but never enough to cross the finish line. Bonds rose from 59% to 66% before falling off the ballot entirely when his time ran out. The era committees now hold the keys to their potential induction, and it remains to be seen whether these smaller groups of former players and executives will be more or less favorable to the candidates Costas has spent his career criticizing. Schilling requested to be removed from the ballot after his support dropped from 71% to 58%, frustrated by the way his post-career controversies overshadowed his pitching. And Rose remains on the permanently ineligible list even after his death, with no clear path forward and no consensus on whether he deserves forgiveness. But Costas has also suggested a potential solution, a way forward that acknowledges the messy reality of baseball history without abandoning the moral standards that define the Hall of Fame. He has proposed that the Hall should function as a museum of the sport's entire history, including its darker chapters, the scandals and the cheaters, and the people who broke the rules. By inducting suspected steroid users or banned gamblers with plaques that detail their transgressions in plain language, the Hall could maintain its commitment to historical accuracy while upholding its moral standards. A plaque for Barry Bonds could acknowledge his greatness before the alleged PED use, and then explain what happened after, letting visitors understand the full story. A plaque for Pete Rose could celebrate his 4,000 hits, and then state clearly that he was banned for life in 1989 for gambling. This transparency model would allow fans to make their own judgments about these players, rather than erasing entire eras from the record or pretending the controversies never happened. It is a middle ground, a compromise between Costas's hard-line stance and the reality that baseball has always been messy, full of flawed humans who did extraordinary things on the field while making terrible choices off it. But as long as the permanent ineligibility list remains a barrier, and as long as the three true outcomes continue to dominate the modern game, the rift between the traditionalist view Costas represents and the reality of baseball today will likely remain unresolved. And maybe that is okay. He has spent decades defending the same principles, even when it made him unpopular with players and fans, even when it put him at odds with the biggest stars in the sport who could have made his life difficult. That kind of conviction is rare in any field, and in a world where everyone seems willing to compromise their values for clicks or ratings or social media followers, Costas stands as a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, even if you lose. Baseball is not perfect and never has been. The game has survived scandals that should have killed it, past scandals from Black Sox to steroids. The question is, what story baseball tells itself? Will it be honest or erase the uncomfortable parts? Costas wants the honest version, the messy version, the version that admits baseball is played by humans who make mistakes. and sometimes those mistakes are unforgivable. And that might be the most loving thing he could do for the sport, demanding that it live up to its own ideals instead of settling for comfortable lies. So here's the truth. Bob Costas does not hate these legends as people. He hates what they represent in the larger story of baseball's decline from grace. He hates the choices that compromised the integrity of the numbers and made it impossible to trust the record books. He hates the lies that followed the cheating, the decades of denial and evasion and half-truths. He hates the way the sport prioritized short-term profits and television ratings over long-term credibility and institutional health. But underneath all that frustration and anger is a deep, abiding love for what baseball used to be and what it still could be if people cared enough to fix it. And maybe that is the real legacy of the Costas era, not the feuds or the critiques or the moral judgments that made him famous and controversial, but the reminder that baseball matters in ways that go beyond wins and losses, that the numbers tell a story that connects generations, that the history is a living thing that deserves to be protected, that the game at its best is something worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. And if that means calling out the legends who broke the rules and tainted the records, then so be it. Someone has to be the guardian of the record. Someone has to care enough to fight when everyone else is ready to move on and forget. And that someone has been Bob Costas. If you made it this far through all 7 names and all the controversy, do me a favor. Hit that like button so this video reaches more people who care about baseball history. Subscribe to the channel if you want more deep dives into the legends who shaped the sport and the feuds that still matter. And drop a comment telling me whether you think Costas is right to hold this hard line, or if he is stuck in a romanticized past that never really existed. And if you want more stories about the players who changed baseball for better and worse, stick around, because we are just getting started with this series.
It's not fun being a bridesmaid. You never live it down. But it still hurts. It does. The team we had in '75 was young, had a great team, and after '75, we thought we'd be in 2 or 3 World Series in the next 5 years, and 11 years later. It's hard to get there.
Evans rips it toward left field. High she goes, and see you later, baby. Grand slam.
And I said the fans, they make it special. And once you learn that they're emotional, you fall in love with them.
Dwight Evans once looked a reporter dead in the eye and said, "I hate his guts." That phrase, coming from one of the most composed and professional men to ever put on a Boston Red Sox uniform, stopped people cold. Because Dwight Evans did not talk like that. He was the quiet one, the steady one, the Gold Glove right fielder who played with dignity and discipline for 2 full decades and rarely said a harsh word about anyone in public. He was the kind of player coaches would point to when they wanted to show younger guys what a pro looked like. So when he started naming names, when he started listing out the players he genuinely despised, the baseball world paid very close attention. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. If you love these deep dive old school baseball stories, tap the hype feature right now and give this video some hype so more fans can find it and enjoy it alongside you. Now, the title of this video says 7 legends, and that is absolutely true. Evans had 7 legendary opponents on his list, men whose names are known to any serious baseball fan. But before we get to any of them, we have to talk about the one man who was not a legend at all. Because without this man, and without one single pitch on one specific night, the hate list might never have been built. His name was Mike Parrott. He was a pitcher for the Seattle Mariners. And on August 28, 1978, he threw a fastball that changed the entire direction of Dwight Evans' career, and in a real way, shaped who Evans became as a competitor. It was the 7th inning at Fenway Park. The Red Sox were in a pennant race, battling the Yankees for first place in the American League East. Evans stepped into the batter's box just like he had done hundreds of times before. Parrott wound up and delivered. The pitch did not break toward the strike zone. It came directly at Evans' head. Evans had no time to fully get out of the way. The ball struck him in the head. He was unconscious before he hit the dirt. Players from both teams froze. The crowd at Fenway went silent in a way that stadiums only go silent when something truly frightening has happened. Evans had to be carried off the field by his teammates. He was taken to New England Baptist Hospital that night and kept for observation. Doctors examined him. The injury was serious. And here's the part that speaks to the culture of that era. Evans came back to play just 5 days later. 5 days after being knocked unconscious by a fastball. By every modern standard of sports medicine, that is a terrifying decision. We know now that the brain needs significant recovery time after a concussive event, and that returning too soon can cause lasting damage. But in 1978, the understanding of head injuries in sports was primitive. Toughness meant getting back out there. So Evans got back out there, and for the next several years he paid a heavy price for it. The damage that lingered was not obvious to anyone watching from the stands. but Evans lived it every single day. He developed persistent double vision, which doctors call diplopia. That means his eyes were not aligning correctly and his brain was receiving two separate images instead of one. For a baseball player, this is devastating in ways that are hard to overstate. An outfielder needs to track a fly ball from the moment it leaves the bat, reading the trajectory through air, through changing light, around the sun, off strange angles. A hitter needs to pick up the rotation of a baseball out of a pitcher's hand from 60 feet away and make a decision in less than half a second. When you are seeing two baseballs instead of one, that task becomes nearly impossible. You are guessing. And guessing does not work against major league pitching. The vertigo that came alongside the double vision was in some ways even worse. Vertigo is not simple dizziness. It is a full neurological disruption where the brain creates a false sensation of movement. The room tilts, the horizon shifts, the ground does not feel stable even when it is perfectly still. Evans described standing in the batter's box during this period as the worst feeling he had ever experienced in his entire life. The spatial disorientation was constant and unpredictable. He could not trust his own senses. And for an athlete at the highest level of professional sports, who has spent his entire life building an implicit trust in his body's ability to tell him exactly where he is in space, that betrayal of the senses is psychologically crushing. He became gun-shy. That is the term players used. It means that a hitter flinches on inside pitches, bails out on breaking balls that do not actually threaten him, and loses the ability to commit fully to his swing because part of his brain is always guarding against danger. Evans did not become gun-shy because he was weak. He became gun-shy because his brain had received genuine evidence that standing in the batter's box could put him in a hospital. That is a rational response. It just happens to be incompatible with being an effective hitter in the major leagues. Look at the numbers from those years and the story becomes clear without needing any words at all. Before the beating, Evans was building steadily toward becoming a complete offensive player. After it, something went flat. His ability to drive the ball for extra bases dropped and stayed down for several seasons. His on-base percentage, which measures how efficiently a hitter reaches base, stopped growing the way it had been. He was still a productive player by the standards of the era, but the upward trajectory that had been there before August of 1978 simply stalled. The prime years between ages 26 and 29, when most hitters reach their peak development, were the years Evans spent fighting a battle inside his own nervous system. The turnaround came gradually and then all at once. By 1980, there were signs of recovery. By 1981, with the help of hitting coach Walt Hriniak, Evans finally broke through in a dramatic way. Hriniak taught him a hitting philosophy built around keeping the head perfectly still throughout the swing and making contact with a slightly downward bat path. This technique, almost as a side effect, helped stabilize Evans's visual field. It gave his brain a simpler mechanical process to rely on, reducing the variables that were causing his sensory system to produce unreliable information. The results were stunning. His slugging percentage jumped to levels he had never reached before. He led the American League in home runs that season. It was the offensive breakthrough that made people start asking what would have happened if Parrott had not stolen those years from him. Evans never blamed Parrott for throwing at him intentionally. He was clear about that. His anger was not about malice. It was about competence and responsibility. His position was simple. If you are a pitcher in the major leagues, you have an obligation to your fellow professionals to have enough control over your pitches that you do not send men to the hospital. Parrott did not have that control. He was a professional who was not capable of meeting the basic safety standard his profession required. And in Evans' world, that failure was unforgivable because of the consequences it created. The incompetent professional is dangerous in any field. In baseball, the incompetent professional can end careers with a single pitch. That is the foundation. That is the event that built the walls of Evans' worldview as a competitor. Everything else on this list has to be understood through that lens. A man who had been put down by a fastball, who had spent years clawing back from neurological damage, who had felt what it was like to have his career threatened by physical force, had zero tolerance for anyone who treated that kind of danger carelessly. The 7 legends who follow made him feel that way for different reasons, but the same fire was burning underneath all of it. We are going to count down the 7 legends starting from number 7 and working our way toward number 1. Each one earned their place on this list through specific actions and specific violations of the code Evans lived by. Let us get into it. Number 7 on the list is Jack Morris. Morris was the ace of the Detroit Tigers through much of the 1980s and one of the most competitive pitchers of his era. He is in the Hall of Fame, inducted in 2018, and his supporters point to his reputation as the best big game pitcher of his time, someone who rose to every important moment and delivered when the stakes were highest. Plenty of people love Jack Morris. Evans was not one of them. On the mound, Evans saw Morris as unnecessarily nasty in a way that went beyond normal competitive intensity. Morris was known for brushing back hitters, meaning throwing pitches close to a batter's body to force them away from the plate and make them uncomfortable about leaning in. Every pitcher does this occasionally, and it is a legitimate part of the game. Hitters who crowd the plate need to be moved back, or they will punish any pitch over the inner half. But Evans believed Morris turned that tactic into something uglier. He felt Morris was not trying to establish the inside part of the strike zone in a strategic way. He felt Morris was using the threat of physical pain as a form of personal intimidation, as a way of asserting psychological dominance over hitters through discomfort rather than through superior craft. Given what Evans had experienced with Parrott, a pitcher who treated inside pitches with that kind of casual aggression was someone Evans could not respect. It brought back the feeling of a game being played with someone else's safety as an acceptable cost of doing business. But the issue that placed Morris specifically on Evans's list, the thing that made it more than just a competitive dislike between two intense men, had to do with the baseball players' union. The Major League Baseball Players Association, the union that represents all players, was fighting some of its most important battles in the 1980s. Free agency, the right for a player to choose his own team when his contract expires, had only been established in the mid-1970s. Salary arbitration, the process through which players could challenge low contract offers, was still being negotiated and refined. Pension rights and minimum salaries were all still contested territory. The union needed every player to stand behind it. The power of a union comes entirely from solidarity. One player who breaks ranks weakens everyone else. Evans believed in the union and what it represented with genuine conviction. He had seen firsthand how a player's career could be disrupted or ended in an instant, and he understood that without the union's protections, players were completely vulnerable to whatever owners decided to pay them, or however they decided to treat them after an injury. The brotherhood of baseball in Evans' mind was not just a nice idea, it was a practical necessity. Morris, in Evans's assessment, was a lone wolf who did not share that commitment. Evans felt Morris put his personal brand, his reputation as a tough competitor, above the collective interests of the players around him. Whether that manifested in how Morris behaved during labor actions, how he talked about union negotiations, or simply in the overall attitude he projected, Evans read it as selfishness. And in Evans's ethical code, a man who benefited from what others sacrificed to win without being willing to contribute to that effort was betraying his profession at a fundamental level. Number 7, Jack Morris. Nasty competitor on the field. Brotherhood breaker off it. That is Evans' verdict. Number 6 is George Brett. This entry still surprises people when they hear it, and it is worth taking time to explain why, because on the surface it seems almost impossible. George Brett is one of the most celebrated players in baseball history. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1999 with a near-perfect ballot. His 1980 season, when he threatened to bat .400 for a full year, is one of the most captivating single-season performances the sport has ever seen. He was tough, passionate, relentless, and seemingly everything that Evans himself would have admired in a competitor. They were both playing the game hard and playing it to win. But Evans's criticism of Brett was not about character in a broad sense. It was about a very specific thing that Brett and the Kansas City Royals did on the bases that Evans believed crossed the line from aggressive to calculated dangerous. The complaint was about late takeout slides. To understand why this mattered so much to Evans specifically, you need to understand the physics and the purpose of different kinds of slides. A clean, hard slide begins several feet before the base. The runner drops to the ground early, uses momentum to skid toward the bag, and reaches out to touch it. It is aggressive and sometimes painful for the fielder to absorb, but the purpose is genuine. The runner is trying to reach the base safely and perhaps disrupt a double play in the process. That is legitimate. It has always been part of the game. A late slide is different in a very specific and important way. It begins at the bag itself or even beyond it. After the play is essentially complete, the runner has already been put out or has overrun the base. The momentum of the slide carries the runner directly into the fielder's lower body, targeting the shins and knees after the time when the slide could have any effect on the outcome. The base is behind the runner. The only thing in front of them is the fielder's legs. As a right fielder, Evans was regularly in positions where he might be backing up throws to second base or chasing relayed throws in the infield gap. He was a target for those slides when covering bases or moving through infield areas on backup plays. He cited the Royal style and Brett specifically as practitioners of this late slide approach. From Evans's perspective, there was no baseball purpose to a late slide. You are already out. The play is over. The only result of continuing into the fielder is to potentially damage their legs. And Evans, who saw every physical threat to another player's body through the filter of his own experience with how quickly injury could derail a career, read that as intentional harm dressed up to look like hustle. A player can be genuinely great and still do dirty things. That was Evans' point about Brett. Greatness at the plate did not earn you a pass for how you behaved on the bases. And the reputation for playing hard did not excuse you if that hardness came with a calculation to hurt the men standing in your path. Number 5 is Al Cowens. Cowens was an outfielder who played for the Kansas City Royals and later the Detroit Tigers, among other teams. He was a fine player who had some excellent seasons and won a Gold Glove of his own. But for Dwight Evans, the name Al Cowens was attached to one specific moment that Evans described with a word he almost never used about another professional player. Evans called what Cowens did gutless, public, direct, unambiguous. That word from that man carried enormous weight. Here is the timeline. In 1979, Ed Farmer was pitching for the Chicago White Sox. Cowens was playing for Kansas City. Farmer threw a pitch that struck Cowens in the face and broke his jaw. That is a devastating injury, painful and frightening, and requiring weeks of recovery. Cowens was furious. Everyone who played the game understood that. But then came 1980. Both Farmer and Cowens had moved to the Detroit Tigers. They were now teammates on the same roster. And one afternoon during a live game, Cowens came to the plate and hit a routine ground ball. Farmer was covering first base to receive the throw from the infield. Instead of running through the bag the way every base runner is taught to do, Cowens turned directly toward Farmer and attacked him from behind. He tackled the pitcher from the back while the pitcher was completely unaware that anything was coming, during the middle of active play with the ball still in motion. For Evans, this broke two separate rules of the code he lived by, and breaking one would have been bad enough. The first violation was the waiting, a full year. That was not a moment of passion. That was not heat rising up in the middle of a game. That was a planned, premeditated attack. Cowens had sat with this for 12 months and decided exactly when and how to act. That kind of cold calculation transformed what might have been understandable into something calculating and predatory. The second violation was the attack from behind. This was the one that made Evans use the word he used. In the culture of the game as Evans understood it, if you had a grievance with another player, you confronted him. You let him see you coming. You gave him a chance to respond. Even in a brawl, there was an expectation of facing your opponent directly. What Cowens did was the opposite of that. He chose the most cowardly method available. A surprise attack on a man who had his back turned and no chance to protect himself. In Evans's vocabulary, gutless meant exactly this. It meant you did not have the courage to face someone honestly, so you used unfair surprise to take them down instead. Evans rarely called out other players in public. He kept his opinions inside the clubhouse as a rule. The fact that he chose to make his feelings about Cowens a matter of public record tells you how deeply the incident offended his sense of what it meant to be a professional athlete and a man. Number 4 is Goose Gossage. Gossage is in the Hall of Fame. He was inducted in 2008 after being one of the most dominant relief pitchers anyone had ever seen. He threw a fastball that generated almost supernatural velocity for the era, and he stood on the mound with a presence that seemed to tell every hitter that they were already behind before they even stepped in. Hitters from that period describe facing Gossage as one of the most intimidating experiences of their careers. His numbers back up every word of that reputation. Evans looked at all of that and called him a villain. Not a great competitor, not a fierce adversary, a villain. And he called him a headhunter, which in baseball means a pitcher who throws at hitters' heads, not for any strategic purpose, but specifically to generate fear of physical harm. The debate over inside pitching has existed as long as the game has. Pitchers are supposed to claim the inside part of the plate. A hitter who leans over it without consequence will hit anything a pitcher throws over the middle of the zone. Moving a hitter off the plate with a pitch close to the body is a legitimate technique. It has always been part of the competitive vocabulary of pitching. Pitchers like Jim Palmer and Catfish Hunter, both contemporaries of Gossage, would work inside aggressively but stayed below the shoulders. The purpose was positioning, claiming space, preventing the hitter from setting up comfortably. They were not targeting heads. Evans believed Gossage was doing something fundamentally different. He believed Gossage was using velocity aimed at the upper body, and sometimes the head, specifically to put the thought of injury in the hitter's mind, not to move them off the inside corner, not to claim the strike zone, but to make them scared. To put a fraction of hesitation into their decision-making at exactly the moment when hesitation meant they were already beaten. That, Evans argued, was not pitching. It was psychological coercion through the threat of physical trauma. Consider who was saying this. A man who had been hit in the head, who knew from direct experience what that ball felt like making contact, what the moment of unconsciousness was, what the months of double vision and vertigo and sensory confusion cost. Dwight Evans did not need to imagine what a pitch to the head might do. He had lived the aftermath. And a pitcher who used that outcome as a tool, who made a career weapon out of the fear of that result, was someone Evans could never see as anything other than a man exploiting the most dangerous moment in the sport for personal advantage. Number 3 is Thurman Munson. Munson died tragically in a plane crash in August of 1979 at the age of 32. He was the captain of the Yankees, beloved in New York, respected across the league for his toughness and his competitive fire. Discussing his place on this list requires acknowledging that reality with honesty and respect. Evans was not celebrating the man's death or speaking ill of him without cause. Evans simply had a genuine, long-standing, and mutual dislike with Munson as a competitor, and any honest account of Evans' animosities has to include it. Munson was the heart and soul of the Yankees teams of that era. He was surly and rough and deliberately confrontational. He used psychological pressure as a conscious strategy. Standing in against a left-handed pitcher with Munson crouching behind the plate, you would hear things muttered under his breath, feel his presence as an aggressive intrusion on your concentration. He was vocal. He was abrasive. He was the kind of competitor who treated every at-bat as a personal confrontation between two men rather than a moment in a game. Evans was none of those things. He was private. He was controlled. He did not perform his emotions or use aggression as theater. He went to work. He did his job. He let the results determine how people felt about him. The contrast between their styles was total, and it created a dislike that was real on both sides. Evans admitted openly that Munson was the player in baseball he most wanted to humble. The choice of that word matters enormously. To humble someone is not just to beat them, it is to make them feel lower than they believe they were. It is to puncture the pride of a man who wears that pride loudly and publicly. Evans wanted to be the one standing across from that pride and reducing it in some meaningful, on-field way. That is a specific and personal desire that tells you everything about the depth of feeling between these two men. The rivalry was the Red Sox and Yankees rivalry distilled into two individual personalities. Munson was everything the Yankees were in that era. Loud, winning, difficult to deal with, seemingly convinced of their own superiority. Evans was everything Evans was. Quiet, principled, fighting to meet and exceed that dominance through skill and preparation rather than volume. Number 2 is Graig Nettles. Nettles was a third baseman who had one of the most spectacular World Series defensive performances anyone had ever seen. He was a genuine talent. But for Dwight Evans, none of that mattered compared to what happened on May 20th, 1976, in a brawl at Yankee Stadium. What Nettles did that day, to a man Evans played alongside every day, stayed with Evans for the rest of his career without softening or fading. The fight began when Lou Piniella ran into Carlton Fisk at home plate. Both dugouts cleared. Players from both sides poured onto the field. These moments were part of the culture of the era, and everyone understood the unwritten rules of how a baseball brawl was supposed to work. You pushed, you grabbed, you maybe threw some punches, and crucially, you fought without trying to permanently injure anyone. The point was to express and release the tension that had built up, not to end careers. Nettles grabbed Red Sox pitcher Bill Lee, who was a left-handed pitcher known as Spaceman, and slammed him to the ground with his full weight landing on Lee's throwing shoulder. The shoulder injury Lee suffered was severe. It damaged the structure of the joint badly enough to alter the remainder of his career. For Lee, a pitcher who relied entirely on his ability to locate his pitches precisely, a healthy throwing shoulder was literally everything. Nettles attacked that specific, vital thing. He did not punch Lee. He did not push him away from the fight. He targeted the instrument of Lee's livelihood and tried to destroy it. Evans watched it happen from close range, and it locked itself into his memory as a permanent marker of what Nettles was and what the Yankees were capable of. The brawl was already understandable to Evans as an expression of tension. What Nettles did was something else entirely. It was an attempt to take away a man's ability to play baseball permanently. In a competition, you try to beat your opponent. You do not try to eliminate their capacity to ever compete again. The line between those two things was sacred to Evans. Nettles crossed it completely. Number 1 on Dwight Evans' list is Lou Piniella. And this one makes sense on every level when you trace it all the way through. Piniella started the 1976 brawl with the collision at home plate. His actions on that day set in motion the chain of events that included Nettles injuring Bill Lee. But the reason Piniella sits at the top of this list is not just about that day. It is about what Piniella represented to Evans on a much larger scale. Piniella was everything about those Yankees teams that Evans could not stand. He was loud. He was emotional and demonstrative in ways that Evans found showy and undignified. He was aggressive and confrontational as a personal style, not just as a competitive strategy. He made everything feel like a battle of personalities rather than a contest of baseball skills. When Evans thought about everything he disapproved of in the Yankees of that era, Piniella was the most visible human face of it. The Yankees under Steinbrenner were spending money in ways the sport had never seen. They were buying their rosters through financial dominance. Evans came from a world where you built something through development, loyalty, and collective effort. The Yankees were a shortcut. They were using their payroll to skip the parts of team building that required patience and sacrifice. To Evans, there was something corrupt about that, something that violated the spirit of honest competition. And Piniella, walking around as loud and as entitled, as if he had personally earned every win, was the symbol of it. When the brawl happened, when Piniella crashed into Fisk and everything exploded, Evans saw the Yankees' true self come to the surface in that moment. The arrogance that was always just underneath the bravado finally expressing itself physically. He fought that day with everything he had, not just for Fisk, not just for Lee, for the belief that you did not get to behave like that. that the game and the people who played it deserved better. Together, these 8 men form something more than a grudge list. They form a complete moral portrait of how baseball could be degraded and what it looked like when someone refused to accept that degradation. Each name is a different failure. Parrott is incompetence that becomes dangerous. Piniella and Munson are arrogance wearing a champion's uniform. Nettles and Cowens are cowardice disguised as physical toughness. Gossage is intimidation dressed up as skill. Brett is dirty play hiding behind a reputation for hustle. And Morris is selfishness that takes what others built without contributing to it. Dwight Evans sat across from all 8 of them in the American League for years. He stood in against them, stood beside them in near proximity during some of the most heated moments in the sport, and he never looked away from what he believed they represented. He held a standard. He measured himself against it. He measured them against it. He found them lacking. His own numbers stand up to serious scrutiny. His career WAR of 67.2 ranks him favorably against several of the men he despised who wear Hall of Fame plaques. His 8 Gold Gloves say that for 8 different seasons, the voters believed no right fielder in the American League was better with a glove than Dwight Evans. His 385 home runs were the product of a hitter who rebuilt himself from the ground up after suffering a brain injury that would have ended many careers. The Hall of Fame has not given him a plaque yet, though he is currently in the consideration pool for the Modern Era Committee. Whether that recognition comes or not, the career was real, the character was real, and the code was absolutely real. He loved this game at a depth that few players ever reach. He loved it enough to be genuinely angry when the people inside it treated it carelessly or dishonestly. That anger, properly understood, was not bitterness or jealousy. It was respect for something he believed in being violated, and these 8 names were the violations he could never let himself forget. That is what made Dwight Evans who he was. Not just the defense, not just the eventual power numbers, not just the longevity. It was the refusal to pretend that things were fine when they were not. The refusal to look the other way when someone crossed a line that mattered. The willingness to say, I hate his guts about a Hall of Famer because he believed the Hall of Famer had done something wrong. That kind of conviction is rare, in baseball and in life, and it is worth remembering. But consider what this era of baseball actually looked like for the men who played inside it. The American League East in the 1970s and early 1980s was one of the most claustrophobic, pressure-filled environments professional sports has ever produced. Teams played each other 18 or 19 times per season. Before the expansion of the playoff format, finishing second in the division meant nothing at all. You either won the division or your season was over. That winner-take-all pressure created a specific kind of intensity that is hard to fully appreciate from a modern perspective when multiple wildcard teams go to the playoffs every year. In that environment, Evans saw the same faces over and over again throughout every season, year after year. Piniella across the diamond, Munson crouching behind the plate, Gossage warming up in the bullpen for the 9th inning, Nettles at third, spinning that famous glove. These were not distant rivals he encountered a handful of times. They were regular fixtures in the compressed geography of his professional life. The familiarity did not breed tolerance. It bred a very precise and detailed contempt. The Red Sox and Yankees rivalry of those years was personal, in a way team rivalries rarely become. The 1978 pennant race, which ended in the famous one-game playoff that broke the hearts of Red Sox Nation, was a year Evans spent compromised and fighting his own body after the Parrott beating. The Yankees won that year, and Evans watched it happen while seeing double and trying to keep the horizon line from tilting on him. Think about what that combination must have felt like, physically suffering from an injury caused by incompetence, watching the team whose players he despised most take the division away. That is a specific kind of pain that compounds itself. His disdain for the Yankees was never just about losing. It was about what he felt they represented and how they went about winning. Steinbrenner's Yankees were assembling rosters through financial dominance in ways the game had not seen before the advent of free agency. To Evans, there was a purity to competition that the Yankees' approach violated at its core. Real competition meant building something together, developing players through the system, winning through accumulated skill and teamwork. Buying talent at a premium was, in his view, a way of purchasing success that others were earning the harder and more honest way. Piniella was the loudest expression of that culture. Munson was the most combative. Nettles was the most violent. Gossage was the most physically intimidating. Each of them represented a different face of a Yankee organization that Evans found objectionable from its foundation. And each of them earned their spot on his list not just by being Yankees, but by doing specific things that violated specific principles Evans held. What Evans built over those 20 seasons was something that outlasts the bitterness of any individual rivalry. He built a reputation as a man who played the game exactly the way he believed it should be played, and who held every opponent to the same standard he held himself. He was not asking for perfection, he was asking for honesty, competence, safety, and solidarity. Those were not complicated demands. They were the foundation of what professional competition was supposed to mean. The fact that several of his antagonists ended up in the Hall of Fame while Evans himself waited years for serious consideration is one of the genuine ironies of baseball history. Brett, Gossage, and Morris all received their plaques. Munson might well have joined them if not for the tragedy of his death. Evans, whose career numbers compare favorably to all of them, spent years on the ballot without the recognition his supporters believed he deserved. He is currently being considered through the Modern Era Committee process, which gives the Hall another opportunity to correct what many serious students of the game view as an oversight. But here is what matters more than any plaque or any vote. Dwight Evans played baseball for 20 seasons with a complete understanding of what it cost him, what it demanded of him, and what it was worth to him. He played through a brain injury that would have ended most careers. He rebuilt himself from the ground up in his late 20s and became a more dangerous hitter in his 30s than he had been in his mid-20s, which is almost unheard of in the history of the sport. He won 8 Gold Gloves. He was there every day doing the work, honoring the game. And when he looked around the field at the men who were not honoring it, he said so. He did not stay quiet out of professional courtesy when he believed something important was being violated. He held a line. He named names. He used harsh words when harsh words were the only honest response to what he had seen and experienced. That is not bitterness. That is character. Those grudges were not petty, they were principled. And the game was better for having a man like Dwight Evans inside it, watching carefully, holding everyone to a standard he had paid a real cost to maintain. He gave everything the game asked of him. He asked the same of everyone around him. That was always Dwight Evans. The game rewarded him for it in the end.
Give everything you got to every at-bat, every pitch, concentrate like crazy.
It's a great feeling. It's a great feeling to have when you're down in a ball game, to feel like 5 games in a row you've overcome the lead. It's a real feeling of confidence.
First of all, it's a language barrier, and because of that, I think he can't be a guy that would sort of sit in a circle with 4 or 5 American players and talk about the game.
Mike Schmidt once said that a player's style would make him hate that guy as an opponent. Those were not the words of a bitter old man. Those were the words of a legend who spent his whole career carrying grudges, getting into brawls, and clashing with some of the biggest names in baseball. Today, we are talking about 9 players Mike Schmidt absolutely could not stand. I hate his guts. That is what this story is really about. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Mike Schmidt is one of the greatest third basemen who ever lived. 3 MVP awards, 10 Gold Gloves, a World Series ring, an 18-year career spent entirely in Philadelphia. He did things on a baseball field that almost nobody else ever has. But Schmidt was quiet. He was analytical. He was deeply sensitive to criticism in an era when baseball rewarded toughness, volume, and raw intimidation above almost everything else. He played his best baseball inside his own head, processing the pressure privately and converting it into performance. That combination, great player, internal processor, high sensitivity, did not always coexist peacefully with the culture of the sport around him. The era Schmidt played in was loud, physical, aggressive. Veterans held young players down to establish the pecking order. Pitchers threw at batters without a second thought and expected no apology. Brawls were common, and sometimes celebrated as proof of a team's toughness. Coaches screamed across clubhouses. Hustle was not just expected, it was treated as the core measure of a man's character. And Schmidt, analytical and reserved, often looked wrong to the people around him, even when he was performing at an elite level and producing results nobody could argue with. Before we get into the list, if you are watching this on YouTube, hit that hype button right now. The hype feature lets you show love for videos you think deserve more attention. If Schmidt's story is worth your time, take 2 seconds and give this video some hype. It means a lot and it helps the channel grow. Now, the most recent controversy on this list is where we open. Because it happened decades after Schmidt retired, and it still blew up in his face in a major way. Then we go back in time. We go through 9 names, 9 feuds. Some were silent rivalries fought entirely through statistics. Some turned physical and left real damage behind. Some nearly ended entire seasons. Here's the order, counting down from 9 to 1. We start with number 9 and work our way up to number 1. Let us go. Number 9, George Foster. Some rivalries are loud. Fights, arguments, trash talk in the press, statements that make headlines the next morning. Then there is the kind that simmers quietly for years, never boiling over in public, but burning hot just the same. That is exactly what Mike Schmidt had with George Foster. This was not a feud anyone heard about in real time. There were no confrontations on the field, no war of words in the papers. It was a cold war fought through box scores and award votes and the slow accumulation of seasons, and Foster won more rounds than Schmidt would have liked. George Foster played for the Cincinnati Reds during one of the most dominant runs in baseball history, the Big Red Machine. Cincinnati in the mid to late 1970s was an offensive powerhouse, a team that seemed to generate stars at every position. Foster was right at the center of it. He led the National League in home runs twice and in runs batted in 3 times during a stretch that directly overlapped with Schmidt's rise to prominence. He was a feared, elite hitter who competed with Schmidt for the biggest individual prizes the sport had to offer. The rivalry reached its most intense point in 1977. Schmidt hit 38 home runs that year. In almost any other season, that kind of production would have put a hitter in serious MVP consideration and probably at the top of the ballot. Not in 1977, because George Foster had one of the greatest offensive seasons in the history of the National League that year. Foster hit 52 home runs and drove in 149 runs. He won the NL MVP award in a runaway. Schmidt finished well behind him in the voting, despite his own genuinely excellent numbers. There was nothing Schmidt could do about it. Foster was simply operating on a different level that season, and the award reflected that reality completely. What made this rivalry particularly frustrating was not any one season. It was the sustained proximity over multiple years. Both men were right-handed power hitters in the same league, competing for the same prizes year after year. From 1976 to 1981, their peak numbers were remarkably close. Foster hit 198 home runs during that stretch. Schmidt hit 221. Foster drove in 671 runs. Schmidt drove in 612. Foster batted .296. Schmidt batted .271. Foster slugged .546. Schmidt slugged .556. The gap between them was genuinely narrow. Every season felt like a direct competition, and the margins were close enough that a single hot month could flip an award result in either direction. Schmidt never publicly expressed resentment toward Foster. That was not in his character. Schmidt was not someone who aired his private frustrations in the press. But the research is direct, that a silent, competitive resentment existed between these two men over that period. They were constantly in each other's way. Every time Foster won an award or led a major offensive category, it was a concrete reminder that Schmidt had a rival operating at nearly the same ceiling. For a player as internally driven and sensitive as Schmidt, that kind of sustained competition does not leave you without feelings. It just leaves you without a place to put them publicly. Foster was not the guy who hit Schmidt with a pitch or insulted him in the clubhouse. He was the guy who kept taking what Schmidt was reaching for. Sometimes the most lasting friction comes not from someone who despises you, but from someone who is just as good as you and knows it. That is number 9, and it sets the tone for everything that follows on this list. Number 8, Dave Kingman. If George Foster was the rival Schmidt respected, but quietly resented, Dave Kingman was the one Schmidt privately could not stand for entirely different reasons. This was not about competing for the same awards or chasing the same ceiling. This was about a fundamental philosophical disagreement over what baseball was supposed to look like, what a baseball player was supposed to value, and what the game deserved from the people who played it professionally. Dave Kingman was enormous, 6 feet 6 inches tall, with raw power that was genuinely awe-inspiring to watch in person. He led the National League in home runs twice in his career and hit tape measure blasts that people talked about for years after they left the yard. When he made contact, the ball went an extraordinary distance. On those occasions, he could look like one of the most dangerous hitters in the entire sport. The problem, in Schmidt's view, was everything else. Kingman struck out at historic rates. His batting averages were poor throughout his career, finishing at .236 for his time in the majors. His on-base percentage was one of the lowest for any regular player in his era. His defense was widely regarded as atrocious by players and analysts alike. He played for 7 different teams over the course of his career because organizations kept growing tired of what he cost them in exchange for what he gave back. One description of Kingman from that era said he had the personality of a tree stump. People around him generally did not enjoy the experience of being his teammate. Schmidt was the opposite in almost every way that mattered beyond the home run column. Yes, Schmidt hit for massive power. He hit 38 home runs in 1977, the same year he lost the MVP. He finished his career with 548 home runs. but he also won 10 Gold Gloves. He worked deliberately and consistently throughout his career to reduce his strikeout rate. He built his on-base percentage into something respectable. He made himself into a complete player, someone who contributed in every phase of the game. He spent 18 years with one organization because he was worth keeping through both his peaks and his more difficult stretches. To a player who put that kind of effort into being a total ball player, watching someone like Kingman get celebrated purely for raw power felt like a genuine insult to the craft. All or nothing was not Schmidt's idea of baseball. It was, in his private view, a party trick performed at the expense of everything the game actually demanded. Kingman's approach treated defense and plate discipline and team chemistry as optional extras. Schmidt had spent his entire career proving they were not optional. They were the point. What made it worse was that Kingman could occasionally look just as good as Schmidt in a single box score. The most famous example came on May 17, 1979, at Wrigley Field. Kingman hit 3 home runs that afternoon and drove in 6 runs for the Cubs. For one afternoon, his numbers looked dominant. But Schmidt refused to be outshone. He hit 2 home runs of his own, including the game winner in the 10th inning, and the Phillies won an extraordinary 23-22 game. Schmidt delivered in the moment that mattered most. That was the distinction, at least in Schmidt's mind. The private contempt was real and well documented. That earns number 8 its place on this list. Number 7, Joaquin Andujar. Stepping back into the early 1980s, we come to a pitcher who irritated Mike Schmidt in a way that was both tactical and deeply personal. Joaquin Andujar pitched for the St. Louis Cardinals during the intense National League East pennant races of that decade, when the Cardinals and Phillies were regularly fighting for the division title, and neither team had much patience for the other. He was a talented pitcher who produced real results.
He was also temperamental, eccentric, theatrical, and wildly aggressive on the mound, in ways that Schmidt found objectionable at a fundamental level. Andujar had been acquired by the Cardinals from the Houston Astros during the strike-shortened 1981 season. His career had been inconsistent before that, but under the guidance of pitching coach Hub Kittle, who served as a steady father figure to the volatile Dominican pitcher, Andujar found a level of consistency he had not previously maintained. In 1982, he compiled 15 wins and a 2.47 ERA. He later put together a 20-win season as well. When he was locked in and performing at his ceiling, he was one of the most difficult starters in the entire National League to face. But the way Andujar pitched was the source of Schmidt's problem with him. He leaned heavily on high, tight, brushback pitches, using them not just as an occasional strategy, but as a constant, aggressive tool of intimidation. He wanted hitters uncomfortable. He wanted them flinching. He combined this aggressive pitching approach with theatrical posturing and wild mound antics that went well beyond the ordinary. Schmidt watched all of this and openly loathed it. He did not see it as competitive intensity. He saw it as a safety threat wrapped in performance art, a reckless style that endangered batters and showed contempt for the basic responsibilities a pitcher carried every time he took the mound. The friction between them reached a visible peak during a critical series in September 1982. On September 14th, with the bases loaded in the 8th inning of a tight game, Cardinals reliever Bruce Sutter induced an inning-ending double play from Schmidt. It preserved a St. Louis victory. The very next day, September 15th, Andujar threw a 3-hit shutout against Philadelphia, pushing St. Louis into first place in the National League East for good. 2 consecutive gut-punch games in a critical stretch of the pennant race.
The irritation did not stop there. Andujar's dominance and theatrical style continued to bother Schmidt through the mid-1980s, across multiple seasons. Every time that brushback-heavy, posturing pitcher took the mound against the Phillies, Schmidt had to face someone whose entire approach he found both dangerous and disrespectful. Number 7 is secure on this list. Number 6, Tug McGraw. Now we shift from opponents across the diamond to someone who wore the same uniform. Tug McGraw was a teammate of Mike Schmidt for several years in Philadelphia. He was the closer who delivered some of the most celebrated moments in Phillies history, including getting the final out of the 1980 World Series and delivering Philadelphia its first championship in nearly a century. He was beloved by fans throughout the city. He was the kind of player who fed on electricity, who thrived on pressure and chaos and the pure adrenaline of a 9th inning with everything on the line. And he gave Mike Schmidt a consistent headache throughout those years. The problem was not personal dislike in any simple sense. It was a fundamental clash in how these two men understood what good baseball looked like and what good preparation required. Schmidt was cerebral
and controlled above all else. He worked deliberately to eliminate emotional swings from his performance. He experimented with transcendental meditation to help himself maintain a flat, focused mental state during games, particularly during the years when he was being regularly booed at Veterans Stadium, and the external noise threatened to get inside his head. For Schmidt, controlling emotion was not weakness or coldness. It was discipline. It was the only rational approach to sustaining excellence across a 162-game season year after year. McGraw operated in a completely different world. His identity was built on emotion, unpredictability, and chaos turned into momentum.
His legendary You Gotta Believe campaign with the 1973 New York Mets had become part of baseball folklore, a rallying cry that embodied his entire personality. He pitched with visible passion every single time he stepped on the mound. When it worked, it was electric and memorable. When it did not work, the results were costly and concrete. For a player like Schmidt, who valued systematic preparation and emotional control above almost everything else, watching McGraw operate from a place of pure reactive instinct was deeply uncomfortable. The moment that most clearly defined their philosophical divide came during the July 1977 series against Pittsburgh, which we will fully detail when we reach number 2. After Schmidt was hurt and removed from the game, McGraw was still in the bullpen. One inning after Schmidt was injured, McGraw intentionally threw a retaliatory pitch that struck Pittsburgh's Willie Stargell. McGraw was immediately ejected. The Phillies lost the game in extra innings. From Schmidt's perspective, that ejection was not loyalty. It was a reckless, emotion-driven decision that cost the team their most important reliever at a critical moment. McGraw felt the moment and acted on it without calculating the cost. Schmidt calculated everything. That gap never closed. Number 5, Pete Rose. This one carries more layers than almost any other name on this list. Pete Rose arrived in Philadelphia in 1979, and his effect on the Phillies was real and significant. His relentless, maximum effort style helped push a talented but chronically underachieving team over the final threshold. The Phillies won the World Series in 1980. Rose was a meaningful part of that run. Schmidt himself acknowledged as much. But Rose also came to Philadelphia, looked at the franchise player, and told him in plain terms that he had been doing things the wrong way. Rose earned the nickname Charlie Hustle from Whitey Ford during a 1963 spring training game after sprinting to first base on a routine walk. That hustle was not something Rose performed on occasion. It was his complete identity. He played harder than almost anyone else in the history of the game, in every situation, regardless of the score or the inning. When Rose arrived in Philadelphia and looked at Schmidt, he did not see a kindred spirit. He saw someone whose approach he found fundamentally lacking. Rose famously described Schmidt's pre-1979 demeanor as pathetic. He claimed Schmidt did not have real hustle before Rose arrived and changed the culture of the clubhouse. That was not a subtle or private criticism. That was a direct, public indictment of the franchise player. The philosophical clash was real. Schmidt led by example through technical execution and internal focus. He was not a screamer. He processed pressure quietly and stayed emotionally neutral, because that neutrality was what allowed him to perform consistently over long stretches. Rose was confrontational, relentless, and built intensity through sheer force of will. Those two philosophies were never going to coexist without friction. Despite the tension and the public insults, Schmidt campaigned for Rose during his own 1995 Hall of Fame induction speech. That was a generous act towards someone who had called him pathetic. But Schmidt's position on Rose shifted in later years. He acknowledged that persistent post-retirement controversies made the character clause increasingly difficult to navigate. Rose passed away at 83 in October 2024. Commissioner Manfred posthumously removed Rose from the permanently ineligible list on May 13, 2025, sparking intense debate about legacy and standards. Schmidt had complicated feelings about his old teammate, right up until the very end. The grudge never fully dissolved. Number 4, Larry Bowa. If the Rose situation was layered, the Larry Bowa situation was something more raw and sustained. Bowa was Schmidt's own teammate, the shortstop who played right beside him on the left side of the Philadelphia infield for years. Together, they formed one of the best defensive tandems in baseball during that era. Statistically, they were excellent together. Personally, they nearly destroyed each other more than once and required physical intervention to prevent serious harm. The friction started from the beginning. When the organization pushed Schmidt to the major leagues, based on their belief in his potential, Bowa took it personally. He was a fierce, self-made player who had earned everything through relentless work. Watching a young player get fast-tracked felt deeply unfair. He viewed Schmidt as spoiled and cocky, and he made no real effort to hide that judgment. Rather than offering any kind of veteran guidance during Schmidt's genuine early struggles, Boa needled him constantly. He criticized Schmidt's offensive numbers in front of teammates. He poked at the .196 batting average from the 1973 rookie season. He found ways to dig and probe rather than help develop. For a young player who was already deeply self-critical, that kind of sustained clubhouse harassment from a veteran is genuinely corrosive. The tension eventually reached a breaking point in the visiting clubhouse in Houston. Schmidt later admitted that he almost wanted to kill Boa during that confrontation. 4 teammates had to physically separate them to prevent the situation from becoming something much worse. The managerial transition from Danny Ozark to Dallas Green in late 1979 did not ease anything. Green was a loud, confrontational manager who regularly screamed at the team about players trying to be too cool, a direct shot at Schmidt's reserved intellectual approach. Boa thrived under that energy. Schmidt felt targeted. The division between the two infielders deepened over time. They went on to win a World Series together. They also had a confrontation that required 4 people to stop. That duality is number 4. Number 3, Bob Gibson. Going further back now to the very start of Mike Schmidt's major league existence. When Schmidt arrived in the big leagues in 1972 and began his full rookie season in 1973, Bob Gibson was still one of the most intimidating presences in National League Baseball. Gibson was the Cardinals' enforcer in every sense, a pitcher who had built his entire legacy on dominance, psychological warfare, and the ruthless unwillingness to give anything to any opposing hitter ever under any circumstances. Schmidt in those years was exactly the kind of young player Gibson targeted. He was new. He had not proven anything. He had not earned anything yet. His batting average in 1973 was .196. In his first 40 Major League plate appearances, he struck out 15 times. He was raw, and everyone watching could see it. Gibson saw it too, and his response was to make every single at-bat a test of mental endurance. Gibson used high, tight fastballs to attack Schmidt consistently across those early encounters. This was not primarily about the mechanics of getting a hitter out. This was about psychological warfare. The systematic effort to make a young hitter understand that he was not yet entitled to be comfortable at this level. Schmidt later described Gibson as a deeply feared and disliked opponent who gave absolutely no quarter to anyone, especially not to players who had not yet proven they belonged at the major league level. The relationship was one-sided for a while, but then something shifted on April 22, 1973, during the second game of a doubleheader. Schmidt came to the plate in the bottom of the 9th inning with 2 outs and the game tied 1-1. He was struggling, deeply. The pressure was real, and he hit a walk-off solo home run off Gibson to win the game. Schmidt described this as the most excited he had ever been in his baseball career. It was a psychological breakthrough against the specific pitcher who had been most systematically trying to break him down. But Gibson kept asserting himself, even as his career wound down. On July 27, 1975, in a relief appearance that ended up being career victory number 251, Gibson came into a game against the Phillies and pitched 4 shutout innings. He struck out both Larry Boa and Mike Schmidt in the same inning. Even near the end, Gibson was making sure certain players understood who he was. Schmidt learned hard lessons from Gibson. He learned them through repeated exposure to someone who gave nothing and respected nothing until it was absolutely earned through performance. The education was brutal and permanent. Number 2, Bruce Kison. We've arrived at the feud that left the most concrete and measurable damage behind. Not just bad feelings or philosophical friction or a cold statistical rivalry. This one broke a bone. This one changed a season. This one may have directly changed the outcome of a championship series. Bruce Kison pitched for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Phillies and Pirates rivalry of the late 1970s was built on a foundation of mutual hostility, physical intimidation, and the kind of aggression that regularly crossed lines most teams observed without comment. The tension in that July 1977 series between the two teams began before the most famous incident happened. Pitching in the early part of the series, Pirates starter Bert Blyleven threw a pitch directly under Schmidt's chin during the first inning. He followed it with a tight ball to Greg Luzinski. By the third inning, Blyleven threw another high pitch at Schmidt, who turned and pointed directly at the mound.
Both benches emptied, and the two teams faced off in a standoff, but nothing physical erupted yet. Everything broke open in the 7th inning of the July 8th game. Phillies outfielder Gary Maddox had just hit a tie-breaking 3-run home run off Kyson, giving Philadelphia a 6-3 lead. The Phillies were in control. Kyson retired Larry Bowa on a groundout. Then, deliberately and without ambiguity, Kyson threw an inside pitch that struck Schmidt squarely in the back. Schmidt walked toward first base and said, "Next time, I am coming out there." Kyson replied, "Why wait?" Schmidt charged the mound immediately. He threw punches. Both benches emptied completely. During the chaos, Pirates catcher Ed Ott, a former amateur wrestler, grabbed Schmidt. Phillies outfielder Greg Luzinski subdued Kyson. The brawl was extended and costly. The physical cost to Schmidt was severe. He fractured and dislocated the ring finger of his right hand. He could not return until July 12th. Before the injury, he had already hit 25 home runs. After returning with compromised mechanics from a damaged hand, he hit just 13 more home runs over the entire remainder of the regular season. The lingering effect followed him all the way to October. When the Phillies made the National League Championship Series in 1977, Schmidt batted .063. He was essentially unable to contribute offensively in the most important series of the year. The research connects this directly to the physical damage from the Kyson brawl. The grudge had a measurable cost. A broken finger from a mound charge changed a postseason. That is why Bruce Kyson sits at number 2. Number 1, Odubel Herrera. And now we arrive at the top of this list. Not the most violent incident, not the one that fractured a bone, not the one that ended a playoff run, but the one that was most revealing about who Mike Schmidt truly was beneath the surface of his greatness, and the one that showed most clearly what happens when a legend's standards and blind spots collide with a changing world he no longer fully recognized. On June 6, 2017, Schmidt was decades removed from his playing career. He was serving as a guest color commentator and analyst for the Phillies and appeared on Philadelphia's Sports Radio 94 WIP morning show. The subject was Odubel Herrera, the young Venezuelan center fielder who had become one of the centerpieces of the Phillies' rebuilding process. In 2016, Herrera had been genuinely excellent. He posted a .286 batting average, hit 15 home runs, stole 25 bases, and accumulated a team-high 4.3 WAR. He was 24 years old, dynamic, and one of the most interesting players in the organization. The host asked Schmidt whether the Phillies could realistically build a championship-caliber team around Herrera. Schmidt answered no. And the reason he gave was the language barrier. He argued that Herrera could not serve as the kind of cornerstone leader a winning franchise required because he was unable to sit in a circle with 4 or 5 American players and have a substantive conversation about the game. He could not confront a teammate about their effort or demand accountability from someone who was falling short. The language gap, in Schmidt's reasoning, made the kind of leadership a true cornerstone player needed effectively impossible for Herrera to provide. He also directed criticism at Herrera's style of play on the field. The bat flips, the visible exuberance, the kind of expressive, celebratory behavior that had become more common in the modern game. Schmidt said that Herrera's antics would have made him hate Herrera as an opponent. That word, hate, directed at a current Phillies player by one of the franchise's all-time legends, landed with significant force. The immediate backlash from media and public voices was severe and widespread. Critics called the comments culturally insensitive and dismissive of the contributions and capabilities of Latin American players at every level of the sport. They raised names like Roberto Clemente, who did not speak fluent English and became one of the most beloved and respected players in baseball history. Albert Pujols, Miguel Cabrera, players who did not arrive in the United States speaking English and who still managed to lead clubhouses, anchor franchises, and win championships at the highest level. The historical record directly contradicted Schmidt's premise about language and leadership. Inside the Phillies' own organization, the response was notable. Venezuelan shortstop Freddy Galvis publicly defended Schmidt, saying the comments had been taken out of context and that Schmidt had been a consistently supportive figure during their 8-year acquaintance. Others in the clubhouse pointed to Carlos Ruiz, one of the most respected leaders in recent Phillies history, who had relied on interpreters during the early years of his career and had never been anything other than a genuine clubhouse leader throughout. Schmidt recognized the damage quickly. He issued a direct, personal apology to Herrera and to Latin American players generally on the same afternoon. Herrera accepted the apology with measured dignity. He disagreed with the original premise, but respected Schmidt's legacy in the game.
That was a gracious response from someone who had been publicly undervalued by a franchise icon. This incident sits at number 1, not because it was Schmidt's worst moment as a competitor or the most physically consequential feud of his career. It holds the top position because of what it revealed.
Schmidt spent his entire career developing precise, exacting standards for what a baseball player was supposed to be and how a clubhouse was supposed to function. He had been on the receiving end of enough unfair treatment during his own career to understand how damaging public criticism could be. And yet, decades removed from the game, those same standards produced a public statement that dismissed an excellent young player based on cultural assumptions the history of the sport had already disproven many times over. The analytical mind that helped Schmidt survive Bob Gibson, outlast Larry Bowa, and win 3 MVP awards had a blind spot. And that blind spot was significant enough that it required a same-day public apology. Mike Schmidt is still one of the greatest players in baseball history. Full stop. 3 MVP awards, 10 Gold Gloves, the 1980 World Series championship, an 18-year career with one organization.
That record stands completely on its own, and nothing on this list takes any of it away. But greatness on the field does not mean ease off it. Schmidt's 9 feuds tell a consistent story from beginning to end. He was a cerebral, highly sensitive man who competed in an era that valued loudness and aggression above almost everything else. When his standards and his temperament clashed with someone else's approach, the friction was real. Sometimes it cost him personally, sometimes it cost the team. And sometimes, as in 2017, it cost him something harder to measure than a batting average or a postseason result. Being a legend does not automatically mean being easy to live with. It does not mean being right about everything. And it does not protect you from your own blind spots, no matter how many trophies are sitting on the shelf. Mike Schmidt proved all of that as clearly as he proved anything that ever happened between the white lines.
If you made it this far, drop a comment below and tell us which feud surprised you the most. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We will see you in the next one.